The town of Brookfield was the kind of place where people felt safe leaving their doors unlocked. It was a quiet community, the kind where everyone knew each other's names. At the center of it all was Officer Daniel Hayes, a respected figure in town. He had been with the department for nearly a decade, always seen as a protector, a man who kept the peace. But in the fall of that year, whispers of something unspoken began to circulate. It started subtly, small details that didn't seem to matter until they did. 17-year-old Emily Carter was finishing up her last year of high school, a girl with dreams too big for the small town that threatened to hold her back. She was known for her bright smile, for the way she talked about leaving Brookfield one day to chase something more. She had a future ahead of her, but she also had something she didn't ask for: attention. At first, it was easy to dismiss. Officer Hayes would stop by the diner where she worked, always lingering a little too long. He'd ask about her day, his questions a little too personal. He would drive by her house more often than seemed necessary, a police cruiser parked just far enough away to seem like coincidence. The town saw these moments as kindness, a good officer looking out for one of their own. But Emily didn't see it that way. She felt it, the weight of his gaze, the way his presence seemed to stretch into every corner of her life. It wasn't just concern, it wasn't just coincidence, and yet she kept it to herself. Because who would believe her? He was Officer Hayes, after all, the town's trusted protector. Then there were the moments that no one else saw, the shift in his tone when they were alone, the way his compliments lingered, how his questions about her plans for the future felt like more than idle curiosity, the way he always knew where she was, as if her movements were no longer her own. Emily's friends noticed the way she became quieter, the way she stopped walking home alone. She changed her routes, adjusted her schedule, but nothing made a difference. Because no matter where she went, he was there, watching. The town didn't know it yet, but the story they would soon be telling had already begun. A story about trust misplaced, about warning signs ignored. A story about how quickly safety could turn into something else entirely. Emily felt the shift before anyone else did. She knew the moment she became more than just another familiar face to him. She knew, long before the town did, that Officer Hayes wasn't just watching out for her. He was watching her. Emily tried to convince herself it was all in her head, that the glances, the questions, the way he always seemed to be nearby, none of it meant anything. But the feeling never went away. If anything, it grew stronger. The first real warning came on a night like any other. She had finished her shift at the diner, tying her apron around her waist as she stepped out into the cool autumn air. The parking lot was mostly empty, the neon sign flickering overhead. That's when she saw it. His car, parked across the street, engine running, headlights off. A chill ran through her, but she ignored it. She turned away, walking briskly toward her bike. Then a voice. His voice. "Working late tonight, Emily." She stopped mid-step, forcing a smile as she turned to face him. "Yeah, just a busy night." Officer Hayes leaned against the car, arms crossed. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You should be careful. It's not always safe for a girl like you to be out alone." The words sat heavy in the air. A warning, a suggestion, something else. Emily forced a laugh. "That's what we have officers like you for, right?" She meant for it to sound light-hearted, but the words felt wrong the moment they left her mouth. He nodded slowly. "That's right." She got on her bike, pedaling faster than usual. When she reached home, she locked the door behind her, heart pounding. Her mother was in the kitchen, humming to herself, completely unaware of the weight Emily carried in her chest. She wanted to say something. But how do you tell someone that the person meant to protect you is the one making you afraid? And so she kept quiet. That night, she checked the locks twice, just in case. The days passed, but the feeling never left her. If anything, it deepened. Emily found herself looking over her shoulder, dreading every shift at the diner. The walls of her small town, once comforting, now felt like a trap. Then came the night she knew there was no more denying it. It was late. The sky stretched dark over the empty parking lot as Emily closed up the diner. She waved goodbye to her coworkers, the last to leave. The street was silent, save for the occasional hum of passing cars in the distance. Then she heard it, slow, steady, not rushed, but deliberate. She turned, expecting to see a late-night passerby, but there was no one, just shadows stretching under the streetlights. A prickle of unease ran down her spine. She quickened her pace, gripping her bag tighter. A car engine rumbled to life. Her stomach twisted. She knew that sound. Emily didn't look back. She didn't have to. She felt his presence behind her, creeping closer with every breath. She reached her bike, fingers fumbling as she yanked it free from the rack. The tires wobbled as she pushed off, her legs burning as she pedaled into the night. The car didn't follow, not right away, but she saw it. The headlights flickered on, illuminating the street behind her. A slow, calculated pursuit. When she reached her house, she didn't stop to breathe. She threw her bike onto the lawn and darted inside, bolting the door behind her. Silence. She peeked through the blinds, her pulse hammering. The cruiser sat at the end of the block, unmoving, watching. Minutes passed. Then finally the headlights dimmed and the car rolled away. Emily exhaled, pressing a trembling hand against the door. This wasn't in her head. Officer Hayes had crossed the line, and she wasn't sure if there was any way back. The next morning, Emily barely touched her breakfast. The night before clung to her like a shadow, refusing to fade. Her mother noticed. "You okay, honey?" she asked, setting a cup of coffee down. Emily forced a nod. Just tired. But tired wasn't the word for it. She felt trapped, like no matter where she turned, Officer Hayes was there, waiting. The worst part? No one else seemed to notice. At school, she told herself she was safe. The halls were full, teachers watched the students, and the presence of so many people should have comforted her. Then she saw him, standing by the entrance, his eyes locked on her as students moved past him. He wasn't in uniform, just a man in a button-down shirt and dark slacks. But she knew. Officer Hayes was watching, and she had nowhere to hide. Emily kept her head down, moving through the school halls as quickly as she could. She needed to disappear into the crowd, but her heart pounded as she approached the exit. He was still there. Officer Hayes leaned casually against the side of his cruiser, as if he belonged there, as if he had every reason to be waiting just outside her school. His eyes found hers immediately, locking onto her with a quiet intensity that made her breath hitch. She hesitated, gripping the strap of her backpack tighter. Maybe if she turned around, if she took another exit, she could avoid him. But she knew it was too late. He had seen her. She forced herself forward, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. The walk to the parking lot felt longer than ever, her heartbeat thundering in her ears. When she finally reached him, she kept her voice steady. "Is something wrong, Officer Hayes?" He smiled, a slow, easy smile that made her skin crawl. "Just making sure you're safe, Emily. You know how dangerous the world can be?" Her throat felt tight. "I think I can take care of myself." His smile didn't fade. If anything, it deepened. "That's what they all think, until something happens." The words hung between them like a threat. She swallowed hard, willing herself not to react, not to show him the fear curling in her stomach. "I should go," she said, shifting, her weight from one foot to the other. His gaze lingered on her, unreadable. Then finally he nodded. "I'll see you around." She turned quickly, walking away without looking back. But even as she moved, she knew. This wasn't over. It was just beginning. Emily barely slept that night. Every creak of the house, every distant sound outside her window sent her heart racing. She kept telling herself it was paranoia, that Officer Hayes was just being overprotective. But deep down, she knew better. He wasn't keeping her safe. He was keeping her close. The next morning, she left for school early, hoping to avoid him. The streets were quiet as she biked through town, the autumn air crisp against her skin. But as she turned a corner, her breath caught in her throat. A patrol car, parked on the side of the road, engine running. She couldn't see inside, but she didn't have to. She knew who it was. Her stomach churned as she sped past, refusing to look back. Her hands trembled against the handlebars. Maybe if she acted like she didn't see him, if she pretended everything was normal, he would stop. But deep down, she knew that wasn't true. When she arrived at school, she darted inside without another glance. The halls were a blur as she pushed through the crowd, making her way to her locker. Her fingers fumbled with the lock, her breath coming too fast. "Hey, Em!" You okay? She jumped at the voice. It was her best friend Rachel, watching her with a frown. Emily forced a shaky smile. Yeah, just tired. Rachel's gaze didn't waver. You sure? You look like you've seen a ghost. Emily hesitated. She wanted to tell her. She wanted to spill everything. The way Hayes watched her, the way his presence never felt accidental. But how could she explain it without sounding crazy? So she just nodded. I'm fine. Rachel didn't seem convinced, but before she could press further, the bell rang. Emily exhaled a breath of relief, grabbing her books and hurrying to class. But the feeling of being watched never left her. By lunchtime, she had convinced herself that maybe she was overreacting. Maybe she had misread things. But as she walked to her usual spot in the cafeteria, her phone buzzed. A message. Her hands went cold as she pulled out her phone. The number was unknown, but the words made her blood freeze. Saw you riding your bike this morning. You should be more careful. The streets can be dangerous. Emily's breath caught in her throat. Her eyes darted around the cafeteria, scanning every face. No one was looking at her. No one seemed out of place. But the unease clawing at her gut only deepened. She turned off her phone, shoving it into her pocket. There was no denying it now. Officer Hayes was watching, and he wanted her to know. Emily kept her head down for the rest of the school day, her thoughts racing. Every step through the crowded halls felt heavier, as if she were carrying a weight no one else could see. When the final bell rang, she hesitated before leaving the building, her pulse quickening. She didn't want to walk home alone, but she didn't want to ask for help either. Taking a deep breath, she pushed through the doors, gripping the straps of her backpack as she stepped outside. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the pavement. She kept her gaze forward, willing herself not to scan the parking lot. Then she saw it, the police cruiser, parked across the street. Her stomach twisted. It could be any officer, she told herself. It didn't have to be him, but she knew better. Emily quickened her pace, her hands tightening around her backpack straps. She turned the corner, moving towards her usual route home. Her mind screamed at her to run, to put as much distance between herself and the cruiser as possible. But she forced herself to walk, to act like she hadn't noticed. Then she heard it, the low hum of an engine. Her breath caught as she realized the patrol car had turned onto her street. It was following her. Panic surged through her, and she fought to keep her movements calm. Her house wasn't far. If she could just get home, lock the doors, maybe this would stop. Maybe he would go away. She turned onto her street and picked up her pace. The patrol car slowed behind her, moving at a crawl. She could feel the weight of his gaze through the tinted windows. Her throat tightened, her legs burning as she broke into a run, sprinting up her driveway and fumbling for her keys. The car idled at the curb. Her hands shook as she shoved the key into the lock, forcing the door open and slamming it shut behind her. She stood there breathless, her back pressed against the wood as she listened. The car didn't leave. For several minutes, the low growl of the engine remained. Then finally it revved once and pulled away. Emily's chest rose and fell with shaky breaths. She squeezed her eyes shut. This was more than just watching. Officer Hayes wanted her to feel trapped, and it was working. Emily didn't leave her house that night. Every shadow stretching across her bedroom walls felt like a warning. Sleep didn't come easy, and when it did, her dreams were filled with headlights creeping along the street, a patrol car idling just outside her window. The next morning, she hesitated at the front door, her fingers frozen over the lock. Would he be there? Would he be waiting? Emily sat in the darkness of her bedroom, knees pulled to her chest. Her phone was gripped tightly in her hand, the screen black. She had turned it off after the message, but she couldn't shake the feeling that he was still watching. Outside, a car passed down the street. She held her breath, listening. Was it him? Was he parked outside again, just beyond the glow of the streetlights? She crawled toward the window, barely parting the blinds. The street was empty, but that didn't mean he wasn't there. Somewhere out of sight, he was waiting, and he wasn't going to stop. Emily tried to tell herself it was over, that maybe, just maybe, he had lost interest. But deep down, she knew the truth. Days passed with no messages, no patrol car lingering outside her house, no encounters at school. It should have been a relief. But it wasn't. It was a warning, the quiet wouldn't last forever. Each night she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, waiting for something to happen. A knock at the door, a shadow at the window, a message from that unknown number. But nothing came. The silence pressed in on her like a heavy weight, suffocating and endless. Her mother noticed the change. "You've been acting strange lately, Em. Are you okay?" Emily forced a smile. "Just stressed about school." Her mother nodded, but there was concern in her eyes. "You know you can talk to me, right?" Emily wanted to believe that. But what could she say? That a police officer, a man sworn to protect, had fixated on her? That she felt like prey being stalked by a predator no one else could see? No one would believe her, not without proof. That Friday as she left school, she hesitated at the front steps, scanning the parking lot. No police car, no sign of Officer Hayes. She started walking home, the autumn air crisp against her skin. With each step, she tried to shake the feeling of unease clawing at her stomach. Maybe it really was over. Then as she passed an alleyway, a sound made her freeze. A footstep, slow, deliberate. Emily turned her head slightly, just enough to glance over her shoulder. Nothing. The street was empty, but her heart pounded as she picked up her pace. Every instinct screamed at her that she wasn't alone. She rounded the corner to her block, her house finally in sight. Relief flooded her, but then she noticed something that made her blood run cold. Her front door was slightly ajar. A chill ran down her spine. She knew she had locked it that morning. Her pulse pounded as she stepped forward, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She pushed the door open a little further, the hinges creaking in protest. The house was silent, too silent. She stepped inside, her fingers gripping the strap of her backpack like a lifeline. Her eyes darted around, searching for anything out of place. Then she saw it, a single object on the kitchen table. Her heart lurched as she approached, her knees nearly buckling beneath her. It was a small, folded note. Her fingers trembled as she reached for it, unfolding the paper with painstaking slowness. 4 words. Neat. Precise. A message meant only for her. "See you very soon." Her breath left her in a sharp exhale, her vision tunneling. She staggered backward, the note slipping from her grasp and fluttering to the floor. The silence was over. The real nightmare was about to begin. Emily wanted to believe the worst was behind her, but the silence that followed Officer Hayes' sudden disappearance from her daily life was not comforting. It was suffocating. The absence of his patrol car outside her school, the lack of unsettling text messages, the way she no longer felt eyes following her, it was all too calculated. She knew he was waiting. The question was, for what? Rachel had noticed Emily's change in demeanor, pressing her for answers in the days following the last message. But Emily deflected, afraid that speaking the truth would somehow make things worse. Now as she walked home late one evening after a study session at Rachel's house, she felt the weight of that decision settle heavily on her shoulders. The night air was crisp, the distant hum of cars barely reaching her ears. She quickened her pace, hugging her arms close to her chest. Her house was only a few blocks away. Then a flicker of movement. Her breath hitched as she caught the glint of headlights in her peripheral vision. A slow-moving vehicle crept down the street, its engine barely making a sound. Emily's pulse skyrocketed. She didn't need to turn her head to know who it was. She walked faster. The car matched her pace. Her hands clenched into fists as she resisted the urge to break into a run. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing her fear. Then just as suddenly as it appeared, the car turned a corner and disappeared into the night. Emily let out a shaky breath, but the relief was short-lived. The silence that followed was heavier than before. She could feel it now. He wasn't gone. He was waiting for the perfect moment to make his move. Emily's hands shook as she locked the front door behind her. She turned the deadbolt twice, checked the window latches, and even pulled the curtain shut. But no amount of barriers could ease the fear crawling under her skin. She should tell someone. She knew that. But she also knew how that conversation would go. A decorated police officer with years of service? No one would question his integrity. It would be her word against his, and she had nothing. No proof, no messages, nothing tangible. just a gut-wrenching certainty that she was being hunted. Her phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. She jumped, her heart nearly stopping. When she reached for it, her fingers trembled. Unknown number. She hesitated before tapping the screen. "Are you afraid yet?" The phone nearly slipped from her grasp. She inhaled sharply, her chest tightening. This wasn't over. It was escalating. A knock at the front door sent her into a blind panic. She backed away, her breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. The knock came again, louder this time. She forced herself forward, peeking through the peephole. "Rachel!" Relief crashed over her. She fumbled with the lock, yanking the door open. Rachel frowned. "Why do you look like you've seen a ghost?" Emily hesitated, debating whether to tell her everything. But before she could respond, her phone buzzed again. This time, she didn't need to look at the message. Somewhere he was watching, and he wanted her to know. Emily barely slept that night. Every sound outside sent her heart racing. The floorboards creaked as the house settled, but each shift felt deliberate, like someone was moving just out of sight. Her mind played cruel tricks, painting shadows into figures lurking in the corners of her room. By morning, exhaustion clung to her like a weight. Rachel texted, asking if she was okay. Emily considered lying but settled on the truth. "I think he's getting closer." Rachel's reply was instant. "We need to go to the police." Emily stared at the words, a bitter taste rising in her throat. The police wouldn't help. The police were the problem. As she sat up in bed, her phone buzzed again. A picture. She gasped. It was a photo of her bedroom window, taken from outside. Emily's breath caught in her throat as she stared at the photo on her screen. Her bedroom window, her safe space, now violated. Someone had been there. Number, not someone. Him. She shot up from her bed, rushing to the window. The blinds were still closed, just as she had left them the night before. But that didn't mean anything. The picture had been taken in the dark. He had been there, watching, waiting. Her stomach twisted violently. How long had he stood outside? How close had he come? She backed away from the window, pulse hammering in her ears. Her phone vibrated again. Another message. "Don't ignore me." Terror coiled around her chest, squeezing tight. This was different. The messages before had been calculated, taunting. But this was a command, a warning. Emily's hands shook as she typed out a response to Rachel. "He was outside my window last night. He sent me a picture. 3 dots appeared, then disappeared, then nothing." Emily clenched her phone. Rachel was probably trying to figure out what to say, but there were no right words. Nothing could fix this. She couldn't stay here. Her mother had already left for work. If she wanted to get out, now was the time. She shoved her phone in her pocket, grabbed her backpack, and slipped out the front door. The cold morning air hit her like a slap. The street was quiet, only a few distant cars humming along the main road. She scanned the area, half expecting to see his patrol car parked down the street. Nothing. Still, she felt it, that presence lingering just beyond sight. She took a shaky breath and started walking. Her plan was simple: get to Rachel's house, figure things out from there. But as she neared the next block, movement caught her eye. A car, a familiar one. It wasn't marked, but she knew it too well. Dark sedan, tinted windows. It was his. It rolled forward at a slow, measured pace. Not too fast, not too slow. Just enough to let her know he was there, watching. A shiver raked through her spine. She could run. But to where? He was a cop. He could follow her anywhere. Her phone vibrated again. Another message. Nowhere to hide. Panic surged through her. She turned on her heel and darted down a side street. She had to think, had to act fast. She wasn't safe anywhere. Not at home, not outside. But she knew one thing for certain. This wouldn't end until one of them stopped running. Emily's breath came in shallow bursts as she stared at the picture on her phone. It was proof, irrefutable. A photo taken from outside her window in the dead of night. He was here. Her stomach clenched as she backed away from the screen. Her mind screamed for her to run, but there was nowhere to go. He was always one step ahead. Then a sound, the creak of the front door. Emily spun around, pulse hammering in her ears. She had locked it. She was sure of it. The deadbolt had been secure, the chain latched. But now it stood slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness cutting into the dimly lit hallway. She swallowed hard, stepping back, every instinct telling her to flee. And then he stepped inside. Officer Hayes. His uniform was gone. In its place, dark clothing blended with the shadows. His expression was eerily calm, as if this was just another routine stop on his patrol. But the look in his eyes was something else, something colder. "Emily," he said softly, shutting the door behind him, "you've made this much harder than it needed to be." Her body refused to move, fear anchoring her in place. "Get out," she whispered, barely recognizing her own voice. He sighed. "You don't understand. I've been patient. I've waited for you to see, to realize that we belong to each other." His voice was smooth, coaxing, like he was explaining something simple to a child. "But you kept running. You kept lying to yourself." Emily's fingers twitched toward the knife block on the kitchen counter. Just a few more steps. If she could grab one, he saw. In an instant, he lunged, his hand closing around her wrist, yanking her forward. "Don't," he warned, his grip tightening. "You don't need to be afraid. I would never hurt you." His breath was warm against her cheek. The smell of him, coffee, aftershave, something metallic, turned her stomach. She jerked her arm, but his grip was iron. "Let go of me!" A flicker of something dark passed over his face. His other hand rose, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead. "Shh. You're safe now." Safe. The word made her snap. Emily moved without thinking. She stomped down on his foot, using the distraction to wrench free. She stumbled back, her fingers closing around the handle of a knife. He lunged again. She swung. The blade sliced through fabric, then flesh. Hayes let out a strangled gasp, his eyes widening as he staggered back, clutching his arm where blood seeped through his sleeve. Emily didn't wait to see his reaction. She bolted, out the door, down the steps. She ran. Footsteps pounded behind her, but she didn't dare look back. Lights flooded the street as she burst onto the sidewalk, her scream tearing through the night. Then, sirens. A blur of flashing red and blue. The screech of tires. Police officers swarmed the street, weapons drawn. "Emily, get down!" a voice shouted. She dropped to her knees, hands over her head. Hayes skidded to a stop behind her, chest rising and falling. His hands twitched at his sides, his face shifting between fury and something else. Realization. This was it. "Officer Hayes," a cop barked, "put your hands where we can see them." For a moment he hesitated. Then a slow, chilling smile crept across his face, and he reached for his waistband. Gunfire split the night. Emily flinched, squeezing her eyes shut. When she opened them, Hayes lay motionless on the pavement, his hand inches from a weapon he'd never had the chance to use. The nightmare was over, but the scars would remain.